Was Seifana is given, Hacholil Makir Umenagnim Bekinir, the Cholil would bang and they would think they would play on the harp, Ubenevolim, Ubemitzeltaim, the various different kinds of instrument. And each one would play the instruments that they knew how to play on. So these were the way that the simcha was done. On Yom Tov and Shabbos, they couldn't do it. So if it's not a Torah command, we understand, because the obligation of simcha, which is midrabanon, is nid bekoyach, does not have the power to doichazai, to push away the isuf v'nutzuk leishir, the prohibition of using instruments that play on Shabbos and Yom Tov, which is also midrabanon. So the cannot override the prohibition of the rabbanon, the mitzvah midrabanon. As the simcha is said, since we are saying over here that the tzivui is a simcha commandment of Torah, so the question is, why should the obligation of the Torah of the simcha yisera not override the misud rabbanon for the prohibition of the rabbanon from using the instrument of song? As ein shvuz b'mikdash, especially we know that in the Beis Hamikdash there is no prohibition with the rabbanon. And this simcha Beis Sheva was just in the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore there was no room to be geyser. Because sometimes, because you don't want to make it different, but this between the other places in the Beis Hamikdash, but Beis Hamikdash, this was done only in the Beis Hamikdash. So why Taka did we not override this in that case? Euch darf man verstehen, Aleph. So we need to also understand who is the mocker from Rambam. Where is the source of the Rambam? Azus machtem lifnei Hashem lekechem shivas yomim, that rejoicing before Hashem lekechem, that the pasuk he uses there, main the simcha yisera, that this means the extra simcha. Where is the source? It seems just the opposite. Base, because Nochmer, it seems that pasuk is already taken. The chayre, we can go learn as the pasuk is do is not tzivui. If there's simply you say that, how could you possibly learn that this verse is coming to teach us about instruction, about a command for additional simcha? The Rambam himself already says in the previous halacha, as the pasuk is farnuman of another limud, that pasuk is already taken for another lesson that we learn from that verse. It was only in the Beis Hamikdash that they would take it every day. From the 7th day of Sukkot, that you rejoice before Hashem your God. So that is in the Beis Hamikdash, the mitzvahs of lulav, that it was taken for 7 days from this pasuk. How do you have another pasuk for simcha yisera, which is not associated to the mitzvahs lulav? That's specifically for the mitzvahs lulav. And then now the Rebbe is going to ask on some of the specifics that the Rambam brings down in the halachas how the rejoicing was done. Dalet, is Dalet. Right? The Rambam, further the Rambam writes that mitzvah laharbiz b'simcha zu, it is a mitzvah to increase with this joy. And it was not done by the ordinary people, and anybody who wants to. And the Rambam enumerates the great of the sages of Israel, the Rosh HaYeshivas, the head of the academies, Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin, V'chasidim, the righteous, V'azikenim, and the elders, V'anshe Maaseh, and people of action, of good deeds. Heim shahoyu meragdim, they are the one that would dance. Umesapkim, they would clap. Umenagdim, they would sing. Umesapkim b'migdosh, and rejoice in the migdosh b'meichagas sukkos, in the days of the Sukkot festival. Avokolom, but all the people, ha'noshim, ba'noshim, the men, the women, kulam, all of them, boim leaders of the shmaya, they came to see and to listen. They did not actually participate in the actual singing and dancing. Under Moker for the halachis from the Mishnah, the source for this halach is the Mishnah. Over there it says Chasidim v'anshe Maaseh meragdim b'fneim, that it was the Chasidim and the men of action that they would dance in front of them. So it singled out some of these people that were doing it. But the Rebbe says we need to understand, first of all, if it's a mitzvah min Torah, so why would everybody not be obligated like all mitzvah of the Torah? The Torah doesn't say only some people. And number two, the way that Rambam enumerates doesn't seem, he misses out some things of the Mishnah, and he adds a whole bunch of things of the Mishnah. So Aleph, based on the above, if we should accept the above, as the Dasa Rambam is the Simcha Chiv Min HaTorah, that in the view of the Rambam, this joy is an obligation of the Torah. Al Simchas Yom Tov, this is a Simcha for the holidays. This is not merely a rabbinic halacha because of the libation of the water. Is farvos. Why would it be? Why wasn't it done by the ordinary people and anybody who wishes? And all of the people, the men and the women, are only coming to see and listen. How could that be? Number one, Aleph. How come there should be distinctions in the on the observance of a Torah command, a positive mitzvah, which was said in a closed way for everybody, and here we're saying only these people have to do this mitzvah. Base, and the second, who is the mocker of them? Where is the source for this distinction? Number two, the Rambam mentions a whole bunch of different people that would rejoice. And in the Mishnah, it only mentions two categories. The Mishnah is Chasidim and Anshe Maaseh. Chasidim mentioned it, and the Rambam is Meisif. And the Rambam adds, as a Simcham durchgeführt euch, Gedele Chachmei Yisrael, the great of the sages of Israel, Rosh Yeshivas, the head of the academies, Sanhedrin, those are all not mentioned in the Gemara. Then he brings down Vachasidim, and then he also brings down Vazikenim, the elders, and the Mishnah says Anshe Maaseh. So he brings down just two of the Chasidim Anshe Maaseh that is mentioned in the Mishnah, and all the others that the Rambam mentions are not mentioned in the Mishnah. Where does he take this? Nochmer. Further, the Gemara that brings the Braise was very detailed. The Gemara brings down the Braise in which it's related. Was es haben damals gesagt die Chasidim Anshe Maaseh, what they said over there, and then it says die Bali Teshuvah, and also those who are about Teshuvah. They said Asher Mishlachotu Mishachotu Yoshu v'Yimchaleh. So let's haste. Specifically, they said Ashrei Zikenei Seinu Shechipri Elisenu, that their elder has atoned for their past. So there were different categories. Chasid Manash Maaseh Bal Tshuva. That means that there were three categories. Chasidim Anshe Maaseh Bal Tshuva. The Rambam over is von ein Seite. The Rambam on the other hand, on one hand, he adds other categories was very nittermont in the Braise that are not mentioned in the Braise. And on the other hand, is there mashmid Bal Tshuva. He doesn't mention Bal Tshuva. Was very yedermont in Braise, which is the mention in the Braise. So what's going on over here? And then finally, Rebbe is going to want to understand the hemshech of the Rambam brings down the idea of rejoicing in mitzvahs in general. Weiter sagt der Rambam, Hasimcha, weiter sagt der Rambam says, Hasimcha sheyismach odam basisa mitzvah ba'avas hakel. The joy that a person rejoices in doing a mitzvah and in loving Hashem, loving God, shetzivu behem, that Hashem has instructed, that is considered to be a great service. Anyone who lowers oneself, or Michael Gufe, and he makes his body light. In other words, he doesn't look for the respect and everything else. He gets involved in praising and loving Hashem. That he's great, actually. If you lower yourself and you make yourself cheap, then you're actually great and you're honored. He is one who serves out of love for Hashem. This is also David, the king of Israel, said, I was even cheapened myself, even more than I did. David was jumping and dancing, and his wife Michal criticized him. He said that I should even cheapen myself even less than this. But he used to shuffle my and I will be humble in my eyes. So we need to understand. But what's bring the Rambam, the meaning erst in Hilchos Lulav? Why does this idea of the Simcha Shel Mitzvah, the Rambam, bring just now in the laws of Lulav, Hemshech to the Simcha Yisera, as a follow-up to the additional Simcha from the Chag HaSukkos, from the Yom Tov Sukkos? Afilo Eib Kavanosa is to Mitzarav Zayin. The halacha from their Simcha to Noch halacha for Simcha, even if his intention is to attach, to combine the halacha of this Simcha to another halacha related to Simcha, but that does gedarf bringen Bilchus Yom Tov. He should have brought this in the laws of Yom Tov. We talk about the Simchas Yom Tov. But is number one, why that? Because first of all, it's Fardim, it's before the laws of Yom Tov mentioned earlier. Beis Simcha Klolis here, so it's a more general talking about Yom Tov rejoicing. This is a specific to the laws of Lulav and the Simcha Yisera. Bei Gimel V'Iker, see me in a Simcha Dort, in Hilchos Yom Tov, the end of the idea of the Simcha, over there, that's the Simcha B'Peres Shem B'Chlal, talks about over there also about the generally being sameach in the service of Hashem in general, just like here. So we should have brought it down over there, this idea that the Nachisrael, the Chaloisi, the Older should brought it there. Is the fun mashma, a simcha shemitzvah b'chlal. So from this, it appears that this simcha of mitzvah in generally, but the shaykhs to the simcha Yisera b'chag HaSukkos, that is associated, has a connection to this additional simcha of the festival of Sukkot. The Rebbe is going to learn in Vav, the Rebbe is going to learn now that the Rambam does not bring in a new mitzvah sesim in Torah, because this pasuk is taken, as the Rebbe argued before, and it would override Yom Tov if this was a mitzvah sesim in Torah. This is just a way of the Rambam saying that we should add to the simcha a more joy based upon the fact that there's joy in the Torah, not a new mitzvah. Let's look inside the Rebbe's explanation. Well, the Bir Choser, what is the explanation in all this? Der mitzvahs the Rambam bringt dem posik, usmachtem lifnei Hashem alekechem shivas yomim. The fact that the Rambam brings the verse that you should rejoice before Hashem, God, 7 days, al smoker of the Simcha Yisera, as a source for the additional Simcha b'chag HaSukkos, meint nit zu sagen, he does not mean to say, as the Torah zogda achiv noisav, that the Torah is telling us here an additional obligation. Simchas Yom Tov, noisav Simchas Yom Tov, dem chiyuv. That the Torah is telling a new obligation in addition to the obligation we have already in Yom Tov. Simcha Yisera b'chag HaSukkos. There's another chiyuv, more chiyuv on Sukkos. No, that's not what I'm. Nor. The Torah is madgish dem chiyuv simchas Yom Tov b'chag HaSukkos. Since the Torah emphasizes the obligation of simchas Yom Tov by Sukkos, that is the obligation, not simchas Yisera. Bebeis Hamikdash, Mervi Bala Yom Tovim, and this is done more than all the Yom Tovim because the Torah emphasized Smachtum Fnei Hashem Lekechem with regards to Lulav, but the Torah emphasized there more Simcha. Usmachtum Fnei Hashem Lekechem Shivas Yomim. Chotch Meveshin Chiv Simchas Yom Tov, although we know already Simchas Yom Tov from Samachtu B'Chagecha. The far is, so because of that, not there's a mitzvah. Hoysa, there was, they did it that way. Hoysa gefirt in the Shivas Yom, that's why they conducted in those 7 days, B'Migdash, Yom Simcha Yisera. That's why they were that custom to do that day extra Simcha. This has sort of brought out as when it's and Damos that they had custom then Simcha Yisera. Not a mitzvah. That's what the tradition that they picked up. Simcha Yisera in the Simchas Yom Tov Gufa. Within the Simchas Yom Tov, since the Torah emphasized over here the idea of Smachtum by Chag HaSukkah, so they did additional Simcha over there. Mitzader at Gosh in their mitzvah Klolis, because of the emphasis in the general mitzvah for Simchas Yom Tov, which is especially emphasized on Sukkah, so therefore the people conducted themselves with a special Simcha. And thus mean the Rambam, Midam V'Seshreib, Mitzvah halachas weiter. This is what the Rambam means when he writes soon as in 2 halachas later on. Mitzvah laharbis v'simcha zu. What is it? He says it's a mitzvah to increase in this simcha. What is it mitzvah? As make it abazundere mitzvah v'chiyuv from a simcha yiseri. It does not mean a separate mitzvah, an obligation from additional simcha, nor in their mitzvah. For Simchas Yom Tov Gufa, within the mitzvahs, the parameters of the Simchas Yom Tov, is Dohat Gosha V'Hisofa. There is an emphasis and there's an addition, more Simcha, more so, but not a new obligation. He says, move on. So now we understand for what Simchas B'Sashev is Nedochi Yom Tov, why it doesn't override the Yom Tov. Chodsh, the Simcha is verbunden mit dem Posik. Smachtum Fnei Hashem Lekerchem Shivas Yomim. Even though Simcha is connected with the pasuk that you should rejoice before Hashem for 7 days, so that means the first days should also be celebrated. And when you increase Simcha, so you are fulfilling the mitzvahs as of Simcha Yom Tov in general can also use. So there should be an additional Simcha on the first day Yom Tov. But is aber talking chiyuv meyuchad min ha'Torah of the Simcha Yisera, since there is no specific designated obligation of the Torah for the Simcha Yisera, and the mitzvah says of Simcha Yom Tov is Mekayim, and the fulfilling the general mitzvah saseh of rejoicing on Yom Tov, one fulfills oich under Simcha Yisera, that you would fulfill even without this additional Simcha. Kenzen yideicha zayin dem isur. It cannot override the prohibition. Chotcher is not a drabonon. So even though the Isur is only the drabonon, to use instruments on Yom Tov, because there's no very clear mitzvah of the Torah, and therefore, and you fulfill the mitzvah of the Torah without the instruments, so the instruments are not allowed on Yom Tov. And their meat, and also we understand, is like move on. The Rambam learned why the Rambam interprets, he learns as Erev Yom Tov Rishon, he says that it took place before the first day Yom Tov, that they would set up the place for the women for Simchas Beis HaShe'eva. In the pastures, in the Gemara, it's mashma. In the pashtus Loshon the Mishnah, Chotch, as in pashtus Loshon Mishnah is mashma. The Mishnah mashma that it was set up on the day that is after the first day, after the first day Yom Tov Sukkos, they built this. And the Rambam says, no, they built it before Sukkos. And because the Rambam holds that this melacha on Chol HaMoed was not permitted to do, even a Chol HaMoed, because there's no special mitzvah. But Hayois, as if the Simcha Yisod is talking Chiv Miyochem and Torah, since there is no special obligation from the Torah for this extra simcha canal, as mentioned before, is wie kann man zu libir deicha sein, isur asiyas malachim b'chol hamoed. How can you override the prohibition of doing malacha and chol hamoed? How could you do that? The riber, because there's no mucha, the riber, learn the Rambam, as much as Gitov, Erev Yontif. That's what the Rambam said, it was done Erev Yontif. Zayin. Abizeh is move on. So now we understand, since it's not a regular special chibah Torah, why there were differences. Abizeh move on. How could it be? How could we say this? That as in kiyum from the mitzvah stamis, that the fulfilling just a general mitzvahs and given chilukim, there were differences, like verschiedene sugim by Yidden, based on the different categories of Yidden. As the simcha yisera is nitkin chiyuv, since this extra joy is not an independent obligation, nor it is merely an addition and an additional emphasis in an chibuv mitzvahs v'simchas chag sukkos, in the dearness of the mitzvah of the joy of sukkos. Mitzad that was the simcha is mermudgesh and pasuk, because this joy is more emphasized in the verse, as said before, is as in ganzen tolui believe in oifen regesh adam. So therefore, it's entirely hinges in the heart, and it hinges on the way the person feels about it. It's not a regular mitzvah everybody's do. It's a mitzvah that addition that you feel about it. Avivular feel the chavivus mitzvahs to the extent that he feels the dearness of the mitzvahs, and therefore the greater balamadrege, the greater people of stature, the greater people of stature is zeir simcha bastan in them was hoyu meragdim umesapkim v'chulu. Their greater joys consisted that they were dancing and they were clapping. But the other people, the man and the woman, is zeir simcha given viful as kumta from them was boyim diris l'shmaya. To the extent whatever comes out when they came to see and hear, that was their joy. That was their emphasis. Unloid them, according to this, as the simcha yisayda is nitkin chiyuv min ha-Torah, that this additional simcha is not a Torah obligation, nor sees ahisofa mitzvah say the simcha yomtiv, but rather this is addition to the positive mitzvah that we know of the joy of yomtiv. But is tolui in hergesh odem b'chavivus mitzvah zu, and that hinges how the person feels, how much this dear mitzvah is dear to him. But Menach Verstehen will also understand Aleph, number one, that Tam was the Aleph Sugim, the reason why all of these categories, Gedoyle Chachme Yisrael, Chulu v'Anshe Maisa, that is mentioned in the Rambam, the Gederet sages, until the Anshe Maisa Hoyu Oisin Oisei. Why these specifically? Because each of these categories, Vayeder Fuzei, Hotamayla, has some sort of an advantage, was in the Toba de Andre, which does not by others. And therefore also something special in the Chavivus. So each one of them represents a unique advantage in how much they dear for the categories that Rambam mentions. And number two, we'll also understand the Mokir, the source, as the Alle Oizgerechem Tasugim, that all these above mentioned categories, they all participated from the Gemara. We'll see that they all participated in making simcha, and therefore they are enumerated. The Gemara in Babli and Yerushalmi, in the Gemara in the Babylonian Yerushalmi bring Bishmam only quotes by name, not etlich etonoim. There's a few sages are mentioned that they rejoiced in the making of the Simchas Beis HaSheva. When the Zel V'Zeum sich geführt, and it relates how they conducted, Od V'Zeum gesagt, or what they had said, by Simchas Beis HaSheva, by the joy Beis HaSheva. So, Why? While we're sure everybody participated, but we have quotes from several specific names. Gewiss haben sich noch alle Tanoim schon im Beis Hamikdash bestattet. For sure, all the Tanoim that were in the Beis Hamikdash participated in Simchas Beis HaSheva, in the Rejoice Beis HaSheva. Kama v'kama gesagt etwas about them. And many of them had said certain things. Nor those that the Gemara tells us the fact that the Gemara distinguishes and just mentions a few Tanoim and gives their names, no Yosef Lepachos, not any more of these names and not less, singles out these people, is those Valzezain and Koilel alle Sugi, because they include all categories from the Mishtatzim B'Simchas Beis HaSheva, from the participants in the Simchas Beis HaSheva. Und jeder von sie Asug B'fnei Atzmei. And each one of them is a category by themselves. From divos oisin oisa, they would make the Simchas Yisera. Al dafke by these sugim, because it's specifically by these categories, is do the chavivas a mitzvah yuchad. There's in a special way of doing the mitzvahs. And now the Rebbe is going to go through the various different names of the places in which the Tanoim were the ones that said and rejoiced and had the Simcha Beis HaSheva. Oisches. The Gemara says Aleph. Omar Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. So here we have the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. Says Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, K'shayinu smeichim Simchas Beis HaSheva chulu, when we were rejoicing on the rejoicing of Beis HaSheva chulu, loy ta'amnu tam shino, we had not tasted the taste of sleep. We were snoozing on each other's shoulder. Boss is the Mailem Yuchedes from Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. So who is this? So we have a statement from Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. But who is this Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya? What's his special designated advantage? Was to leave them that tell the Gemara. Because of that, the Gemara relates was had gesagt benegeya seine status that which he said as his participation in the Simchas Beis HaSheva. The tell the Gemara relates Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya he would debate the elders of Athens, of Beatuna. They were great sages. And he beat them. Further, the Gemara also relates as far as there is talkus from Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, that before the passing of Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, the sages of Bnei Israel asked by Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, what is it going to be to us? How are we going to overcome these apikursim, those challengers? When the Ratzegi answered with Pasik, and he answered them with a verse of the Eitzam Mibonim, Nisrecha Chachmasam. That while the children don't have any more advice, meaning the Yidden don't have any advice, their wisdom has gone too, so there will be no challenges. Or others with the Pasik by Yemer, Nisa v'nelecha ve'elcha l'negdecha. I will go together with you. So in other words, we have both sides. If there's challenges, there will be answers. From them Zetman as Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya is given for the Gresta for Chacham Israel, that Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya was of the greatest of the sages of Israel. So this, from them, learned the Rambam Arois. And that's why the Rambam learns. The first the Rambam says is, as Gedolei Chachmei Yisrael, the great sages of Israel did the Simchas Beis HaSheva. That fits the category of Yeshua ben Chananya, who is mentioned with regards to Simchas Beis HaSheva. He rejoiced in the Simchas Beis HaSheva. Now let's go to the next base. Amar Olav Rab Shimon ben Gamliel. It's a statement they said about Rab Shimon ben Gamliel. That when he would rejoice in the Simchas Beis HaSheva, he would juggle, and we'd see Rav Shimon Gamliel was one that participated in Simchas Beis HaSheva. The same thing Gemara, as related to the Gemara, is Rav Shimon Gamliel given the sicha Sanhedrin. He was the Nasi, the prince, the head of the Sanhedrin. But Sanhedrin, Gedoylo Uminyonom, the great Sanhedrin, and the number is Shiva Ve'echad V'chulu. So we know there is 74 sages in the Sanhedrin, and the Hagodl B'chochma Shebekulam, the one who is the greatest in wisdom of all of them, they put him as the head over them. He is the head of the yeshiva. He is what's called the Nasi, the greatest of the Sanhedrin, all the way the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the Sanhedrin. The Nasi is the Rosh Sanhedrin. The leader is the head of the Sanhedrin. So he is mentioned with regard to Simcha Beis Sheva. From them, the Rambam as the Sanhedrin. The Rambam says that the Sanhedrin, just as Reb Shimon Gamliel participated, as the Gemara says over there. He would juggle over there. So therefore we see that Sanhedrin participated in Beis Sheva. Number 3, who's the other category? Omru Olav al Hillel Zaken. The Gemara says that they said about Hillel Zaken, but he would say Hillel Hazaken at the Beis Hashem. Now, why are we calling him over here Hillel Hazaken? Even though we always call him, seems like the Zaken part is important. The Bald, the Gemara is Medayik Doi Matzul Hillel Hazaken. Since the Gemara emphasizes to call him the elder Hillel, Choch has become his vert nit der Mon der Teir Zaken. Although in many places the description of Zaken is not associated with Hillel, is moving. Ados is Ahiro in the meaning that this has specific lessons in this matter. The reason why he rejoiced in Simcha Beis Sheva is given was mitzad malose, because of his greatness. Al einer for this kenim, that he was the elders. On their food named the Rambam. Now the Rambam has another category. As the kenim that these kenim are rejoicing in the joy of Beis Hashem. In Yerushalmi, in Yerushalmi, we have one more addition. This takes a little bit more of study and able to explain how we get this Ben Yehoy Tzodek Hoya Mishtabech Bikfit Soisov. This Ben Yehoy Tzodek, he would praise himself as he would jump. So, Bibald, as their Sibur is gebracht, upland for them, since we brought this story is brought down in order so we learn from him. Is the sicha as leibo listem? It's not coming to close up this matter, nor does it Godel be Israel. This is somebody who's great in Israel. This man shebeis hamikdash kaim, the time of beis hamikdash. The novelchas vet gered b'makam achar, about whom it's spoken elsewhere, and we talk to find the Shimas Atanoim, the list of the Tanoim. Gefind mentake, you'd find Reb Shimon ben Yehoy Tzodok. We find it was Reb Shimon, the son of Yehoy Tzodok. So Benegates Reb Shimon ben Yehoy Tzodok gefindt man aber nicht, but we don't find, aber so was Reb Shimon Tzodok, as Chazal so erzählen wegen seiner Malbichedes, that our sage of blessed memory should tell us about something unique, special, Meile of Reb Shimon ben Yehoy Tzodok. Muss man sagen, so we have to say, as the Meile wird ausgedrückt in sein Name Reb Shimon. So we have to say that his advantage is expressed just in his name, Reb Shimon. B'shayches zu Toyar Rebbe, when he's called somebody Rebbe, steht in Tosefta, it says that Mish yesh letalmidim kohen noitz Rebbe. One who has students is referred to as Rebbe. Das heißt, as Rebbe Yeshimon ben Yehoy Tzodok is given a Rosh Yeshiva, that means that he had to be a head of a yeshiva because it's called Rebbe. Und der Fun is the Chocha from the Rambam. That's the Rambam's proof. As Rosh Yeshiva, some sich Mesameach given, Simcha Beis Sheva. Rebbe Shimon, so the Rebbe is Mesameach Rosh Yeshiva. The Chelek can fragen, if them, wie kann man sagen, how could you say, as the Tam, he's telling you because he was a Rebbe, they don't even say the word Rebbe in the Yerushalmi where it mentions it, Ben Yehoy Tzodok, it doesn't even say Shimon. Tabas the Yerushalmi, the mother of Shimon Tzodok, he sleeps like Rebbe. Beis Yerushalmi do al asar ruftim gor Ben Yehoy Tzodok. He just calls him Ben Yehoy Tzodok, but not Rabbi Shimon Ben Yehoy Tzodok. Is the tiritz of them? The answer is Hoyo Mishtabech Bikfit Soiso. He was praising in his jumps. He was bragging about with seine Kfitzes, with his jumping. Und beschas mered wegen eigener Meiles. When you talk about your own greatness, darf man reden bei von Gazelle, you have to speak in such a way, that you should sort of negate any suspicion by others, or your own sense of arrogance. The Riber, and therefore, hat sich angerufen mit Allah, that's why he referred to some language, von Hepach HaKavod, which is opposite of honor. But then if we make it finden by Rabbi Chaim ben Zakkai, as we find Rabbi Chaim ben Zakkai, as redendig wegen sich, when he was talking about it, said, hat gesagt, in Moli Hitiach ben Zakkai's Rosh had, ben Zakkai banged his head, he didn't say, and he would accomplish that would be something bragging, so he didn't just say Rabbi Chaim ben Zakkai, he said ben Zakkai, because hat sich nicht angerufen mit eigenem Namen. He didn't call his own name, nor mer nicht als Azun, it only refers to him as a relationship, as a son of his father, using his father's name. Okay, so now the question is, how come, we know the categories where the Rambam takes them, but now we have to understand how come the Rambam doesn't specify about Shuvas, which the Gemara says. The Rebbe explains that according to the Rambam, about Shuvas is part of the Hasidim, which includes both the Hasidim, both a Tzaddik and a Baal Tshuva. Yud. The Tampa was the Rambam rechet nit Baal Tshuva. Why does the Rambam not come Baal Tshuva? The Rambam learned as the Braise is nit moisif of the Mishnah. The Rambam learns the Braise is not adding addition to the Mishnah, nor is mefarish mefaret, but rather it articulates and its details. Kiderach Braise, as Braise usually do. Those versteht the Mishnah bekitzer. That which is written in the Mishnah short, der Suk Hasidim besteht in Mishnah, when the Mishnah says Hasidim is koilel, sai Hasidim befrat, und sai Baal Tshuva. This includes both the Hasidim, the especially Hasidim, but also Baal Tshuva. V'ozil l'shitosei, and the Rambam goes also according to his view. Rashi touched. Rashi says, "Kol chosid." What is the meaning of a chosid? Chosid havi chosid meikore. Chosid means one who was to begin with a chosid. So, according to Rashi, there is a chosid which was a tzaddik, and then you have Baal Tshuva. Well, if you say "Kemen learn as this is koilech Baal Tshuva," then you can't learn it means Baal Tshuva because it only means one who was a chosid meikore. Over the Rambam Paskin Dilchus Deyes, the Rambam rules in laws of Deyes, a person who is very particular about himself, and he disses himself even from the average view. A little to this, a little to that side, Nikra Chosid is called righteous. This thing can sein, Rachim de Benis, can be by a tzaddik v'chosid meikara. It can either be somebody who is a tzaddik to begin with, and also and mainly on the contrary, by a Baal Tshuva can become a chosid. The Rebbe learned that. Therefore, the Rambam learns that Chassidim should be Mishnah. That Chassidim Mishnah meant Oich Baal Tshuva. That this includes Baal Tshuva. High time the month the Rambam the Besug Baal Tshuva Bazunder. For that reason, the Rambam does not mention the category of Baal Tshuva separately. Nor schreibt Chassidim Stam. He writes Chassidim Stam. But B'Sifrei Meinter Sai Chassidim Mikor Sai Baal Tshuva, because the Rambam says Sefer. When he said the word Chassidim, it means already both. Sai Tzadikim, Sai Chassidim, Sai Baal Tshuva. Yudalef. So now we understand the last issue we had. Why do we bring the Simcha Shel Mitzvah as a follow-up to the Hilchos Lulav of the Simcha Yisera and not the Hilchos Yom Tov? So after all this, move on, because Behemshech to Simcha Beis HaShe'eva is the Rambam Mevayer. As a follow-up to the Joy Beis HaShe'eva, the Rambam explains the Ma'ila for Simcha Shel Mitzvah B'chlal, the advantage of the Simcha Mitzvah in general. V'bal does the Simcha from Beis HaShe'eva is a Ha'yisofa. Simcha Shava is an addition in their Simchas Yom Tov. in the Simchas Yontiv Mitzader Chavivus HaMitzvah, because the mitzvah is dear to you, so you add to the Simcha for Simchas Yontiv. So there is a mitzvah Simchas Yontiv. You're adding because of the, especially because of the love, the dearness of the mitzvahs. It turns out that this is the same idea of a Simchas Mitzvah B'chlal, the idea of a Simcha of a mitzvah. This is an addition on the main, and in the main, Asiyas mitzvah is Hasimcha sheyismach odam b'asiyas mitzvah. That is the joy that the person rejoices when he does the mitzvahs, uba'avas hakel shetzivu b'hem, and the love of God who commanded them. But there's more. In Simcha shel mitzvah b'chlal, is a sacha aggressor reish to be simchas base hasheva. In a simcha of a mitzvah is a much greater novelty than a simcha base sheva. Simchas base hasheva, the simcha of base sheva, that is shem b'matzah simcha b'lavochi, since he's already in a state of joy anyways in any event. Ubshita as atzus is mushlal, so it's obvious that being sad is totally negated, rejected. Is nit shver poil zayin bazich. I soften the matzav, so it's not difficult to impact by you an addition in the situation. Oh, but when we have to be joy for a mitzvah, every mitzvah and every day, and in any condition you are, that becomes actually a great service. That's why the Rambam brings an example from David HaMelech, from King David. That he was jumping and dancing before Hashem with all of his power to avisen, to show how much there needs to be the joy by all mitzvahs, even though it's difficult to push yourself to do this. So based on this, the Rambam goes from the light to heavy. First, it brings the joy of Yontiv in general. All the festivals are mitzvah to rejoice. Then he speaks of the joy of the festival of Sukkot versus a Hecher Aveda, which is higher. Ukenal, I said before, Adoskum Mitzad Chavivus HaMitzvah, the dearness of the mitzvah of Yom Tov. The Noch the Simcha Shemitzvah B'chlal. There you're already B'Simcha because of Yom Tov. Add to Simcha, but then we talk about Simcha B'chlal versus Ashverer and Aveda Gidel. It's more difficult, and it's a big service. You base. This is also a lesson in practice. Person can think, it's okay in the days of the rejoicing. He can be happy. How can he impact himself to be happy after the special time? This whole days of Simcha. So the Rambam says that no, there's Simcha v'Simcha Beis HaSheva. After the joy of the joy Beis HaSheva, hebt sich erst an der Aveda Gedolah of Simcha Shel Mitzvah. Now we're just really starting. The big service is only starting now. Simcha Shel Mitzvah, that's the big Aveda. Warum ständig, feel it Meisachel constantly, even during the weekday. Jedet nur von a Yid, and every movement of a Yid. Warum ständig viel bei Mesachol ist jede nur von a Yidin verbunden mit Avodas Hashem. Every movement from a Yid, even during the weekdays, connected to service of Hashem. So a mitzvah kipshute, either it's a literal mitzvah, or there's not a mitzvah, or there's a pratum kol masechel v'shem shemayim. So details in all your actions should be l'shem shemayim b'chol drachecha de'eyu, and know Hashem in all your ways. L'chein dardos gitom v'erem b'simcha. That's what needs to be done with joy. As the pasuk says, "Ivdus Hashem b'simcha, serve Hashem b'simcha." Agam as Razal Zogan, even though our sages of the best of memory say, it is prohibited for a person to fill his mouth with laughter in this world. Is aber move on, but it's understood. As simcha shel mitzvah is, but when we're talking about a joy of a mitzvah, is adrabah. It's in the contrary. It's an obligation. It's something which is a must. And this specifically that impacts above the idea of laughter. The one who sits in heaven laughs goimer. Laugh at all those that want to press Jews, to those who want to make it difficult for you. Until the fulfillment of the promise as Pinu, our mouth will be full with laughter with the coming of Mashiach, our righteous Mashiach, very soon. This is Mesichas Simchas Beis HaShe'eva, Tavshin Yutes and Tavshin Chav, Shabbos Breishis is Vadus Beis, Tavshin Lamed Aleph.